Hi, I'm Dustin Hoffman, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you a little bit more about this concept of creativity. So at this point, you've probably read my essay and perhaps read some of my short stories. So I am a creative writer and a creative writing teacher, and as I've noted, I have some issues with this term, and I'm going to chat a bit more about it, perhaps elaborating on a few things in the essay, and maybe some more topics will come up. Um, One thing I mentioned briefly in the essay is this idea of can we even teach creative writing? Of course, if I said that that's impossible, then I'd be a charlatan and kicked out of my business, perhaps. But of course, I don't believe that's the case. And there are certain concrete things that I can teach, but can I teach one to be creative? I think that's doubtful and problematic to think so as well. So when I go to actually thinking about rather than writing techniques and craft, which I know how to teach that stuff very clearly, but for teaching creativity, I think of my favorite painters, the surrealists, who kind of surround me in my writing office. I have little prints of Yves Tanguy and his wife Kay Sage that are always behind me. Um, so I love the surrealists, and they especially dug into some interesting ways to think about becoming more creative. And so they were really interested in the subconscious, in dreams. Automatic writing was a big part of what they did, which you did in grade school, in free writing, when your teacher would say just write and let the ideas come and don't worry about editing or anything like that. Like really, we're stealing this from the surrealists who invented this concept. And so much of what they do, and I think what struck me about the surrealists, is really just juxtaposition. So they're taking like familiar elements that we know in our everyday life, but through an unfamiliar juxtaposition, these things become wholly new and different. And I think this is one way to get toward creativity, not just in the visual arts, but and I think just about everything we do. So Rene Magritte is a great example of this, and The Son of Man is the first painting here. The guy in the bowler cap with the apple in front of his face, which was my Halloween costume a few years ago. But we're very familiar with this concept of an apple, and we're very familiar with this concept of a man and an in business attire and such. And also, this is familiar painting subject matter, a portrait of a human. But Rene Magritte puts this everyday object in front of the face, obstructing the very thing that should be the focal point of the painting. And all of a sudden, it's rendered wholly new and unfamiliar and a little unsettling too. So, but really, it's just juxtaposition that's happening here. So think about how positioning creates our concept of creativity, perhaps in this case. Again, lovers kissing, but drape something over drape their faces, and we have a wholly new concept. A portrait of a magician when his doves actually become part of his body. This juxtaposition creates something wholly new. And they invented this game called The Exquisite Corpse, the Surrealists, which was a drawing game where they would quarter the paper. The first artist would draw would have the first quarter of the paper to work with, and these are some examples of the game. And then they draw a little bit, and they draw that first quarter, and then fold it and pass to the next artist, and that artist would just see the last little bits of line, and they'd continue on those lines without really knowing what was on that full first quarter. And then they'd fold again and just show the bottom lines to the next artist, and so on. And the idea here is to tap into a collective subconscious, and again, through the juxtaposition of different creativities and logics, something wholly new becomes created here. And you can, of course, you can play this game as a writer as well, and I do with my students. I have a couple different ways to do it, but even the Exquisite Corpse is a product of the game itself. You write down an article on a sheet of paper, so the or and then you fold it, pass it to the next person, and they write down a modifier, an adjective, exquisite, say, and fold it again, pass it to the next person, and they write down a noun, corpse, for example, and then when you open it up, you have often a really surprising new juxtaposition, a different way to modify a common noun that you may have never thought of before, perhaps. So again, here we have some ways to potentially really teach creativity. Although, is it teaching, or is it just like um, showing one how to tap into this a little bit through practice? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure any of this is wholly practical for my students. Perhaps a good, fun exercise, but um, I'm not sure if you can take any of the surrealist methods and practically apply it at a consistent basis. So let's come back to some of the concepts in the essay and some of my favorite quotes from writers. So from Henry James, he says, try to be one of those on whom nothing is lost. And I think that's perhaps the most important quote I impart on my creative writing students. So to just be a good observer of your own world and to make sure that you don't miss any detail. And through, that one detail, like I talked about in my essay, an entire novel can spin out of that. Um, Another concept to keep in mind that might deal with creativity is this concept of defamiliarization, coined by this Russian guy. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, in 1917. And he was a theorist, but I think it applies a lot into what we try to do as creative writers. Like the surrealist, to take everyday, ordinary subject matter and objects and render them in a way that becomes completely new. Um, so an example of this, my favorite example of this, comes from the poet James Wright, and I'm just going to read his poem real quick, and then we'll go over the how he's using defamiliarization here. So this is lying in a hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. Over my head, I see the bronze butterfly, asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in green shadow. Down the ravine behind the empty house, the cowbells follow one another into the distances of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight between two pines, the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for home. I have wasted my life. So that last line is actually kind of problematic. My students always get so hung up on that. And I'm actually much more interested in some of the imagery that he evokes in this piece, and especially the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. A gorgeous description, but think of what it is describing. It's a description of horseshit, right? But he's rendering this mundane kind of gross subject in a completely gorgeous way, and in this way he defamiliarizes something that's completely familiar. I tell my students, I outlaw, in fact, beautiful sunsets. Don't try to describe a beautiful sunset in a story. That's the job of the Hallmark card creator. Anybody can do that, right? We already know sunsets are beautiful. Instead, if you can make horseshit beautiful, now you're onto something as an artist. And we come back to this idea of showing our audience the world in a new way, through defamiliarization, through juxtaposition, perhaps. So something that served me, as you've seen, if you've read some of my work, um, is writing about my construction experience, is writing about people's occupations, which I find endlessly fascinating. And I think that for me has been good inspiration or a good challenge. Like, how do I take the everyday, mundane, droning work that we do and make it compelling, interesting narrative material? And that's a difficult challenge, perhaps. Although I always keep in mind two of my favorite quotes, one from Joseph Conrad, and this is in Heart of Darkness, and it talks about like what is in work. He says, I don't like work. No man does, but I like what is in the work. The chance to find yourself, your own reality for yourself, not for others, what no other man can ever know. They can only see the mere show and never can tell what it really means. And then George Orwell has this beautiful quote in one of his essays. He says, all people who work with their hands are partly invisible, and the more important work they do, the less visible they are. And if you've ever worked a manual labor job, or if you ever worked in the food industry, you know exactly what he's talking about. The only reason anyone would ever know you exist is if you screw something up and like the food gets sent back or if somebody's complaining. And what a tragedy that is, I think, as a writer, that we are forced into such invisibility. So that's part of perhaps my defamiliarization process, is to bring work into the spotlight, to give it and grant it recognition, to take it out of the invisibility and to see how it defines identities. So here's some, some inspiration for me. Largely, I worked construction for 10 years in Michigan, building houses just before the recession. I was a house painter primarily, although I did some of this. This would be drywall finishing. And my dear friend Chandler was perhaps the best drywall finisher I ever met. And somebody who's good at this, it is an art, a beautiful thing. I thought this picture, in fact, on the right, was especially like aesthetically pleasing to me. And I used to be in these kind of houses all the time, and then I'd cover them up with paint so that no one would ever know that this wonderful artisan was here doing this great craftsmanship work. I covered it up with the paint. Which is maybe problematic as well. So I wanted in my fiction, I want to show the beauty of an artist like Chandler. And he used to, when I once asked him why he's so good at drywall finishing, he said, "You got to hear the mud, man. You got to hear the mud." And I found that so compelling. What the hell could that possibly mean? To listen to the mud, that's what he's working with his trowel knife spreading out across the drywall. Like, what? How could you hear that, and how could that possibly make you good at what you do? But as an artist, I found that very question so compelling, and perhaps like here's where I get to something creative or defamiliarized, this concept of listening to something that's so physical and manual. And I find a beauty in that, in Chandler's concept, that there's like perhaps lyricism in the very sound of something like the mud he's working with. And I want to take something that you wouldn't expect is beautiful and try to bring it into that realm of, making the last year's or the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. I want to show you how beautiful Chandler's work is in my writing. So I'm often seeking to break stereotypes as much as possible, that this is like a gruff, gruesome, brutal work, and show you the gorgeousness and the wisdom and the lyricism here. Um, of course, that's problematic as well, to just simply romanticize manual labor and such. I think it's also important that for a writer to show both sides of it, to not look away from the brutality, from the cruelty of this labor, from the exploitation that exists. And there is a ton of exploitation. In fact, almost every contractor gets a 1099, which means they are self-employed, which means no employer is matching their Social Security or anything else on their taxes, which means they pay a ton in taxes and they have no security in their employment. And this is just common practice in these kind of trades. Like, few people are actually employees, and that's just like one level of the obscene exploitation that happens in the construction world. Anyway, I want to show that stuff. I want to make sure that readers see like the misogyny that exists there, the sexism, the racism, the violence, the cruelty. But I also want to show beauty at the same time. So perhaps I'm back to Magritte, like how to juxtapose these things together to find something interesting, compelling, human, aesthetically pleasing. And I guess just briefly, I wanted to talk about my own process as an artist. Here's a 5-in-1, by the way, the most important tool for any painter to have. In fact, I think every homeowner should have one of these. I use mine all the time, and as a painter, I was always using them. So here's my introduction into my process. As I noted in my essay, I don't believe in writer's block. I don't believe in the muse. I mean, practically, I don't believe in those things. I believe that writing, and I'd say all art is work. It requires the same kind of thing like anything else to be good as an artist. You have to do it every day. You have to put in the time and the hours. You have to sit and stare at a blinking cursor and force the words out. But I found like there is no magic bullet. My students ask me this all the time. Like, how do you get past writer's block? Where do you get your ideas? You know, well, to get the ideas, be the type of person on whom nothing is lost. As Henry James says, be observant of your world at every moment. Be thinking of opportunities for defamiliarization. But then, how do you get through writer's block? You got to force it. You got to work every day and put in the time. And I'll say that's been good to me as a writer. Um, for the last 2 years, I've found a process of making myself produce at least 100 new words a day. And so I'm doing revision also often, but at least when I'm working teaching full time, when it's really hard to produce, 100 words is such a sustainable goal that I can actually achieve it at a consistent level. And it adds up quickly. And usually when I sit down to write 100 words, I get a lot more than that in the sitting, but that's the only obligation I put at myself. And so I think like giving yourself achievable, sustainable goals for your work ethic can be a great way to maybe make it not quite as intimidating. But the sad truth is, like, to get to creativity, I'm sorry to say, it's the same kind of thing with the manual labor that I've done in my life. Like, you got to put in the time and do the work for it to emerge. Anyway, I hope this has been useful. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Just let me know. Take care.